I'm Bethany McLean.
Did you ever have a moment of doubt about capitalism and whether greed's a good idea?
And I'm Luigi Zingales.
We have socialism for the very rich, rugged individualism for the poor.
And this is Capital Isn't, a podcast about what is working in capitalism.
First of all, tell me, is there some society you know that doesn't run on greed?
And most importantly, what isn't?
We ought to do better by the people that get left behind. I don't think we should kill the capital system in the process.
So there's a line that I found chilling in a recent story in the New Republic. It read, "Superficial analyses of why certain tech billionaires are aligning with Trump tend to fixate on issues like taxes and regulations. But that's only part of the story." Stay with me. I know this sounds bland, but it actually leads into a pretty disturbing rabbit hole that is based around an oxymoronic sounding idea, an idea that might actually be oxymoronic, called the Dark Enlightenment.
It sounds like something out of a dystopian science fiction book. And in some ways, it is. The idea is convoluted, as is its intellectual history, but the phrase itself comes from a philosopher named Lick Land. The essence is to reject liberal democracy in favor of more authoritarian forms of government and to leave humanism behind in favor of accelerating technology and capitalism to induce radical changes in society and the economy. Land wrote this stuff in 1992, and he wrote that capitalism had never been properly unleashed, but instead had always been held back by politics, the last great sentimental indulgence of mankind. He has argued that the so-called accelerationists should support figures like Donald Trump to blow up the current order as quickly as possible.
And so this thinking leads directly into something called accelerationism, which basically, as best I can tell, means speed everything up. And if it all breaks, that's good. Land's thinking has intersected with that of another philosopher of sorts named Curtis Yarvin, who, among other things, has promoted dictatorships as superior to democracies and views nations like the United States sort of like outdated software systems. Yarvin wants to re-engineer governments by breaking them up into smaller entities called patchworks, which would be controlled by tech corporations. He argues that American democracy should be replaced by what he calls a monarchy, run by what he has called a CEO, basically a friendlier term for a dictator. Yarvin has also argued that government bureaucracy should be radically gutted. He called his plan, which he articulated in 2012, let's pause on that, 2012, RAGE. It stands for Retire All Government Employees. RAGE, in turn, was captured pretty perfectly in Project 2025, the Heritage Foundation's blueprint for a second Trump administration. Called for firing an estimated 500,000 federal employees and dismantling entire agencies. Now you see where this is going? It matters, and it matters because the ideas have found their way into both Silicon Valley and into the Trump administration's thinking through several paths.
One way is through Peter Thiel, who has invested in Yarvin's startup, hard to tell how real a business it is, and has called Yarvin a powerful historian. Yarvin, for his part, has said about Thiel that he is fully enlightened, but just plays it very carefully. In The Contrarian, Peter Thiel and Silicon Valley's Pursuit of Power, reporter Max Shafkin describes Yarvin as the house political philosopher of the Thielverse, a term for the people in Thiel's orbit. Through Thiel, it has infected his protege, JD Vance, so that there is this guy, Curtis Yarvin, who has written about these things, this is Vance saying, on a right-wing podcast in 2021. He went on to explain how Trump should remake the federal bureaucracy if re-elected. I think what Trump should do is, if I were to give him one piece of advice, fire every single mid-level bureaucrat and every civil servant in the administrative state and replace them with our people. And when the courts stop you, stand before the country and say, the Chief Justice has made his ruling, now let him enforce it.
It has also infiltrated Silicon Valley. In his famous techno-optimism manifesto, and you might be thinking, optimism? Marc Andreessen wrote, "Combine technology and markets, and you get what Nick Land has termed the techno-capital machine, the engine of perpetual material creation, growth, and abundance." Andreessen cites Land and others in his sphere in the endnotes to his techno-optimism manifesto. And lest you doubt that Yarvin has become an important figure, in January 2025, he attended a Trump inaugural gala in Washington. Politico reported that he was an informal guest of honor due to what they called his outsized influence over the Trumpian right.
And Bethany, you say the word chilling because why?
Well, maybe it doesn't matter that there's a philosophy behind what Trump is doing and where some in Silicon Valley have gone. I think it does. This philosophy of sorts that gives ideas that might seem crackpot, maybe they are, some potentially dangerous intellectual heft. I think the theories are also explanatory. Andrew Sullivan wrote this in 2017, and it turns out it was prescient. And he wrote this about the Dark Enlightenment. He wrote, "Willfully blinding ourselves to the most potent political movement of the moment will not make it go away. Indeed, the more I read today's more serious reactionary writers, the more I'm convinced they are much more in tune with the current global mood than today's conservatives, liberals, and progressives. I find myself repelled by many of their themes, yet at the same time drawn in by their unmistakable relevance." I mean, he hit the nail on the head. Luigi, do you find it concerning?
What I find the most concerning is how much the Silicon Valley have seemed to embrace these ideas. Not only from people that have a tradition of being on the right wing, like Peter Thiel, but somebody like Marc Andreessen. He was a square Democrat who financed the campaign of Obama and voted for Hillary Clinton and Biden, and now is out there basically trading in these kind of ideas.
Yeah, ideas are really, really powerful. And it's very rare that people pause to unpack all the ideas and make sure that what the final version that's coming out of their mouth is actually something that they sign on to. But anyway, so how do you understand this term? And let me see if I can say it without tripping over it. But accelerationism, we touched on it a little bit a few minutes ago, but how do you think of it?
I think is a increasingly diffuse tendency, especially in the Silicon Valley, but throughout the country, of basically saying our only savior is technology. And as a result, we should not only let it rip, accelerate as fast as possible, and not get anything in the way. This was clear in Andreessen Manifesto a couple of years ago, that, by the way, immediately recognized being very similar to the Futurist Manifesto that was written in the early 20th century by some Italian poet. What is interesting, all those guys ended straight into the fascist regime as intellectual pillars of the fascist regime. So there is a natural connection between saying, let it rip, we believe in the strength of technology, our only faith is technology, and say, if your only faith is technology, you want technology to rule the world, and we don't want this inefficiency of democracy, inefficiency of even let the people speak. We decide for them because that's what's the best.
Explain that a little bit more. How in Italy back in the day did it turn into fascism? And is that the most prominent example you can think of it? Because in some ways I could see, without a historical example, that you could make the argument that techno-optimism could be really optimistic. And Andreessen says enough in his manifesto that is very pro-human. I'm not sure I believe it, which we should talk about. But why does it inevitably become anti-human, if that's even what we think of as fascism?
So I'm not saying that the only way to be techno-optimist is to be right-wing. However, this idea of technology as a creator of a superior human being is very much in line with the superhuman that is so associated with Nietzsche and to the right wing. And the creator of technology is considered a superior human being, that you don't want him to waste time with poor human beings that have their own little concern. You want to set him free. It's a bit like Atlas Shrugged on steroid, that can break loose from every constraint to save humankind with his superior knowledge and superior creations. I think that this idea is very authoritarian in nature.
Why does it inevitably become, or is it not inevitable, a political movement and not just a business movement? In other words, why doesn't it stay a movement where people are advocating for this in art and technology, even capitalism? Why does it also seem to always become political as it has today?
So my fear is that, especially in the Silicon Valley, they are very clear-minded about what is going to be the impact of artificial intelligence in the next 5 to 10 years, and maybe even the next 2 to 3 years. This impact will be, in my view, very socially disruptive. And so I put words in their mouth, so I might be completely wrong, but my fear or understanding is that they value technology more than anything else. And so if you want technology to progress as fast as possible, you don't want to care about the human disruption that you bring. You want an authoritarian regime to keep the losers silent. After all, the first industrial revolution was triumphed by shooting the Luddite. There were more people shooting the Luddite than fighting Napoleon at the time. Did that accelerate progress a little bit? Yes. How many people left on the side? A lot. Now, it's a trade-off. Do you care about reaching AGI a year earlier, or do you care how many people are left on the wayside? I think that's a trade-off. And clearly, for Silicon Valley, the only thing that cares is to get there sooner rather than later. And you can pretend or claim or think that this is all about the fight with China, but at some point it's about itself. You love technology so much and you think it's a savior, and you want to achieve it as fast as possible. And you want to get rid of all the obstacle. And how do you create a political movement that allows you to do so?
So do you think that either in historical experience or in what you see today, and obviously we're speculating a little bit, but do you think that people, those who are espousing this, believe it because they genuinely believe this is the way forward for humanity? Or do they believe it because it's a way for them to make money and it's a way of simplifying? I guess I'm getting at what I think as I think through asking you a question, that it's a way of simplifying a lot of complexity. If you just forget about the complexity and you just say more is better, it's a whole lot easier than if you try to wrestle with the complexities.
Most people believe what is in their interest. It's very hard to really believe in something and doing something else for your own interest. I think most people don't sleep well at night when they do that. And so the majority of people don't change the way they behave. They change the way they believe so that what they believe coincides with what is in their interest. If you were to do a truth test, to a lie detector test to Marc Andreessen, I believe he's going to pass with flying color. He believes that 100%.
Yeah. And it does actually make something make sense, which is the discrepancy between how Andreessen has described his interactions with the Biden White House over AI and how the Biden White House described those same interactions. It's like it's like they were in two entirely different rooms. But if Andreessen believes that the only way forward is no holds barred, completely unleashed AI development, then he's going to see anything short of that as attempts to hold it, as terrible attempts to hold in the industry, and not as an honest good faith effort to figure this out.
I'm slowly appreciating the impact of all this elite living in California. I never lived for an extended period of time in California, so I cannot relate to that. But the more people I listen, including Ezra Klein, the Thompson and about the book that he wrote with Ezra Klein about abundance, that's kind of an attempt to have a version of techno-optimism, which is not necessarily right-wing. So, and the more there is this disconnect, because on the one hand, you think that this should be the best place in the world to live. You are the frontier of technology, you are the frontier of the liberal elite, you are in a place where it's very warm and pleasant. You should be in paradise, but you're not. You're not, because it takes forever to build even a single family home, let alone a bigger house. It's not because it takes forever to build any infrastructure. In a sense, the bullet train is still a dream after 20 years and I don't know how many billions. It's a nightmare because you go down the side of San Francisco and you see, I'm sorry to say this word, shit in the street. And you're afraid because there are hobos and people who are dragged all over the place. And this is one of the richest cities in the world. I think that the revolt of the Silicon elite against the status quo is broader, and it manifests in some people like Andreessen into basically tendencies toward fascism, and in others like Ezra Klein, a more benign version of utopia, but they are all very much in the spirit of get rid of every regulation and let's build, baby, build.
If you're enjoying the discussions Luigi and I are having on this show, there's another University of Chicago podcast network show you should also check out. It's called Big Brains. Big Brains brings you the stories behind the pivotal breakthroughs that are reshaping our world. Change how you see the world and keep up with the latest academic thinking with Big Brains, part of the University of Chicago podcast network. How does concentration impact the marketplace of ideas, academia, news, information production, and diffusion? What can be done about it? Join Chicago Booth's Stigler Center virtually for a conference on these questions. It's April 10th and 11th. Luigi and I will also interview Thierry Breton, the former Commissioner for Internal Markets of the EU, for a live recording of Capitalism. Register to watch the live stream at chicagobooth.edu/StiglerAntitrust25. You know, one of the things that's confusing to me about this, when you think about the intellectual antecedents behind Andreessen's thinking, is that both Yarvin and Land strike me as fundamentally pessimistic. And perhaps I'm just missing the optimistic part of their thinking, what will be unleashed if we accelerate to this wonderful place. But Yarvin recently said this to the New York Times in an interview. He said, the fundamental premise of liberalism is that there's inexorable march toward progress. I disagree with that premise. And so what do you think? Do you see this worldview as fundamentally optimistic or pessimistic or nihilistic? Or none of those words?
You know, there are, of course, different nuances. Not everybody thinks the same. However, I think that the tendency to push in the direction of a authoritarian state, when you say that countries should be run like companies with a powerful CEO, which is basically an absolute monarch, is straight totalitarian. And then they have this claim that, we protect you with the possibility of actually leaving from the states, because the states are smaller. This is these patchworks or city-states in which people can move around if they don't like the state. This is like some remake of the version of anarcho-capitalism. It's been around with Murray Rothbard for a long time, but was very, very much at the fringe of the intellectual debate. And the Silicon Valley people really love this aspect because they feel that they are the modern hero and they want the modern hero to take over the political system. And so this philosophy is very much in sync with what they believe and what they aspire to.
It is interesting because this idea also that some of us would think of as too far-fetched to become reality. I hadn't realized through this city called Prospero that it already has become reality in some ways, but this idea of freedom cities where you can create these swaths of land that are free from any kind of regulation. And it sounds like, based on some writing, there are people who seriously think this has a chance of becoming real in the Trump administration in the U.S. In other words, Silicon Valley is getting its wish list.
Yeah, they're basically gated communities on steroid, because you're not only a gated community, but within that gated community, there is a ruler that rules for everybody, and you're exempted from any regulation. So we discussed the other week with Sam Peltzman about the inefficiency of the FDA approval. And what they claim is that these cities, you can sell any drugs you want. And when I say drugs, I think it's pharmaceutical drugs, probably also other drugs, because it's a free market everywhere. I think in some sense, this is very attractive to rich people who want full protection from the mob in every possible dimension.
Except I couldn't help thinking that these cities won't last very long if the rich people can't get someone to clean their house and to watch their children. So it does break down at some point, doesn't it? And
they might import them as slaves. Who knows? Maybe in the free cities they allow slavery. Why not? In a sense, if you allow every form of contract, voluntary slavery should be allowed, right? According to their principle.
So is there anything, just to push on this a little bit, is there anything possibly appealing about this idea of freedom cities, where cities compete with each other to offer people the best living standards and the most freedom? Can that coexist with a democracy? Can that coexist with a capitalist system, or does it inevitably descend into feudalism?
The idea of experimenting some stuff at a small scale with a city is not a crazy idea. This is how Deng Xiaoping got China started.
Really?
Deng Xiaoping was very taken by the fact that Hong Kong was very developed and the rest of China was not. And they said, so it's not that we Chinese cannot develop. There's not a culture that prevents it. We need just to imitate Hong Kong. And so it started with the city of Shenzhen, allowing a bunch of freedom that were typical of Hong Kong in the city of Shenzhen, and created a model city. And the city worked very well. And then slowly they expanded this idea to the entire China. And that it brought the success of China. So if this is an experiment to see the effects of some stuff, I completely agree that it's a good idea. If this is simply a way for rich people to isolate themselves, because at the end of the day, they're going to determine that you have no taxes, or you're going to determine that the justice system will be based on arbitration rather than a popular jury. And we know the arbitration tend to favor rich people more. So you're going to have an entire system that is biased in one direction. And that, to me, is the risk.
So speaking of China, do you think that some of the impetus for this is coming from this spoken and unspoken sense that we are losing the race with China because somehow our system of government is inferior to those? And this leads to some other questions, but I'd actually read somewhere that Land, who once was in the UK, has actually moved to China because he loves this techno-authoritarian political system. And he told a reporter that once he lived there, he realized that to a massive degree, China was already an accelerationist society. And would Silicon Valley choose China as long as they could have a China that didn't occasionally just have a temper tantrum and malfunction and lash out at its tech leaders? But is some of this fed by the sense that China's system is somehow better because of the authoritarian nature of it?
If you take China and you take away the leftover of communists that sometimes make them sort of overrule Jack Ma and Alibaba, etc., what do you have left? You have left something called fascism, right?
Yeah.
That's what they like. You know the famous sentence by Roosevelt that said that fascism is ownership of the government by an individual, by a group, or by other controlling private power. So if you take this definition, of course, there are a lot of definitions of fascism, that's what they like. They want a government owned by an individual. And they say very clearly, and I actually do remember, I visited Russia in 2003, and there were some Western observers that were very gung-ho about Russia at the time. And they were saying, because in the West, we have these publicly traded companies with a lot of shareholders, a lot of tension, a lot of saying, here we have the true entrepreneur that own their company 100%. They're young, they're aggressive, they're going to do phenomenal things, they're going to make the country a better place. Now, 20-something years later, you saw that was not the case. And this analogy between the way the firms are run and the way countries are run is really irritating me, because shows, in my view, a lot of ignorance. If you really want to compare firms and government, and firms and market, then you should say that you want a centrally planned economy. because firms are little centrally planned economies. So if you want to run the US economy as a central plan economy, then fine. But if you were trained that you believe in free market, but you want to copy firms, you're wrong. And then you don't understand that there is specialization, that firms are doing what they are better at doing, leaving the rest to the market and sometimes to the government. The government does most of the time the most difficult things. We know that it's much easier to maximize profits than to give away money, because in maximizing profit you have the right incentives, but giving away money is complicated, which I think brings their third mistakes. Firms operate in a competitive market. If I don't like Tesla, I can buy a Mercedes. Governments generally don't do that. And yeah, they want to introduce this patchwork that you can leave, but how can you really leave? There are a lot of friction. It's not a competitive market at all. And even the claim that if you just bring the average CEO, I heard Yarvin say, if you just bring the average CEO to govern a country, you will do much better than the politicians. Now, unfortunately, the country where I come from did do the experiment, and he did not pick the average entrepreneur. Pick one of the best, because Berlusconi, with all these defects, was a much better entrepreneur than Trump. In a sense, Trump inherited a fortune, but Berlusconi made his own fortune, okay? And the country under him was run terribly. So it's not true. Being a politician is a super difficult job, and there is no evidence whatsoever that picking a CEO and putting in place of the politician is going to do a good job.
It always strikes me as just so incredibly strange to hear this dismissive thinking about government coming out of Silicon Valley, which was created by government money. And I get that no one understands exactly how that magic of entrepreneurship and government money came together to create the modern Silicon Valley, but it for sure was government money. And so it strikes me as a really weird, speaking of being ignorant of history, it strikes me as a really weird ignorance of history for them to be as dismissive of the role of government as they are.
I don't think they are really dismissing of the role of government, because, as you said, if they like China, the government play a big role in China. I think what they are really dismissive is the role of democracy. They don't want democracy to get in the way, because democracy slows things down. I understand that if you live in the Silicon Valley and you've seen how difficult it is to get your permission to build your house, you are a bit frustrated by maybe what is called the excess of democracy, or the excess of the veto power that the local councils have on all the decision. So I am sympathetic to this, but I think they are transferring this at a much bigger level, that in order to be an efficient government, you want to not be slowed down by all this issue about democracy, and we should get rid of it. And I think Peter Thiel is the first one to be honest. He said that is incompatible, and he doesn't want to deal with that. And I think that most of the people in this sphere think along the same lines.
Yes, it seems to me that this is all this desire to just simplify the world and strip away what people view as stupid or getting in their way or preventing them from doing and being exactly what they want to be. But I keep thinking, and you were the first one to bring up that wonderful Isaiah Berlin quote that now I think I'm overusing because I'm using it all the time, but freedom to the wolves has often meant death to the sheep, right?
Yeah.
And I think when Peter Thiel says that freedom and democracy aren't compatible, it's basically because the people who say that believe that they're going to be the winners and they're going to be the ones who can consume and accumulate, and that they don't want to have to care about the others who are left behind.
So the scary part is, I don't remember which one of these people in this sphere, but several of them are pretty close and sometimes made even discussion about genetic differences across human types. They basically believe in a superior race, whether this is simply white or maybe is Asian or maybe is other characteristic, but they do believe in a superior race that has the right to rule over the inferior race or inferior races. And some of them make even comments that I don't want to repeat about what you want to do with the inferior people that are falling on the wayside. So to me, is a rediscovery of the worst part of fascism. And I'm scared that people don't see that very clearly.
So the worst part of fascism dressed up in something called accelerationism that gives it a grand terminology that makes it sound like something different, but really it's just the same old ugly stuff being served back at us. And I was really struck by this line in Marc Andreessen's manifesto, which I hadn't read as carefully as I should have until we were preparing for this podcast. And he wrote, we believe, this is going to sound really basic and prosaic, but he wrote, we believe a universal basic income would turn people into zoo animals to be farmed by the state. And I've thought the same thing, that the dignity of work is paramount. And he talks a really big picture and quite lovely sentiments about how people need valuable, meaningful work. But then he skips. If you go from here to there at an accelerationist speed, and AI and the development of technology leaves everybody behind, what do you do to ensure that all those people can have decent work and do not become zoo animals being farmed by the state? He skips. And I think that's one of the things that bothers me about this thinking, is that it just pretends the ugly details don't exist. When it is optimistic, like Andreessen, it pretends the ugly details and the messy details don't exist. When it is really dark, like Yarvin, he says that human beings who aren't useful should be turned into biofuels. And so it feels like there isn't really an attempt to deal with this in a humane way. Not surprisingly, they don't believe in humanism. But I don't think I like the optimistic version of this much more than I like the pessimistic version, because the optimistic version strikes me as disingenuous.
I actually, for once, am optimistic about the potential of AI. We have to face the fact that technology has made us much, much better off than we were in the past. Of course, this was not a costless process, as I was described earlier, but I think as long as technology is directed and controlled by a democratic system, it can bring a lot of benefits to a vast majority and ideally everybody in the population. So I'm sympathetic to some of the points that Ezra Klein and Thompson make in their Abundance book. However, it's dangerous to ignore some of the issue, and particularly it sounds a lot like laissez-faire, laissez-passer is the term of the most extreme version of liberalism, in which you let it all go through. But what I didn't know until recently is the term initially was brought by some entrepreneurs that went to, I think, Colbert and say, laissez-nous faire, let us do it. So this is not that different from what the Silicon Valley is saying now. It's saying, let us do it, trust us, we're so good, and you're just in the way.
But here's another then. Isn't it a fast speed train to where? I mean, say they got their way and democracy is gone and we're run in authoritarian ways such that they can just go at whatever pace they want with AI. What's left on the other side of it? If you don't have a democracy and you don't have a society and you have a world where most people have been reduced to whatever is left when you're not living in a democracy, why would anybody want the world to get there? What good does all the money in the world do you if there's nothing left on the other at the end of that journey, at the end of that speeding train? It seems to me like it's a speeding train to nowhere.
It's possible, but if you are one of the rich billionaires, your life is going to be tremendously better.
How so? They have everything they want already. How does it get better?
No, I think that this is where you need to listen carefully to the interview that Marc Andreessen gave to the New York Times, where he said, until Obama, there was this sense that you could become rich and also have prestige. That's what he calls the deal. And all of a sudden, with 2016, for a number of reasons we can analyze if you want, this alignment broke down. And what they want is be rich and being prestigious. And in this moment, a vast fraction of the population hates them. He doesn't like that.
But
so he wants a system in which is a monarch.
But how is this going to? But people don't like their monarchs. How is this going to get it? How does this?
Actually, that's not true.
But
that's not true. The monarchs are loved, especially by the poor people that the monarchs give bread to. Since the Roman time, you give bread and games, and they're happy and they celebrate you.
So they're just, that's their, I was thinking, how can you have prestige if there's no society left to admire you? But your view is they have prestige in the same way the kings of old did, that they get to go through the streets and there, I guess they won't be carriages anymore. There'll be some sort of flying whatever and sprinkle down little pieces of chocolate on all of the adoring populace.
I think I'm far more conspiratorial than both of you.
No, go ahead. We wanted to break the third wall or fourth wall, whatever it is.
Hi, everybody. This is Matt, the producer of Capitalism. I guess, you're talking about money and prestige, which I'm sure is part of the story. But if you read what a lot of these tech CEOs say in their interviews about AGI, the singularity, which is supposed to be this moment where AI can essentially train itself and thus do anything, at least within the laws of physics. Your mileage may vary on how real you think that is, but many of these people proclaim that they do. And you look at Brian Johnson, the tech multimillionaire, and his Don't Die movement about trying to live forever. I think some of these tech leaders, they really believe that if they can accelerate AGI, they might be able to live forever and build a society where, human labor may not necessarily be required to maintain the world that they're interested in living in. If you look at advances in robotics as well. So I think the reason why money and prestige feel like they can't quite explain these wild political swings is because the goals these people are chasing could be far stranger or weirder than I think we're even used to talking about. Yeah.
So it may not even have a precedence in in history, because in history before, no matter who you were, you died. And in this view of the world, the AI can allow the wealthiest to extend their lives forever. And so then they want a world where they're perhaps the only ones left and have everything to themselves, besides perhaps some little crushed beings on the ground who can look up and admire them.
Or go to Mars and be left alone in Mars.
Yeah. Okay, this was happy.
Okay, on this nice note,
bye everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for making it work.
Capitalism is a podcast from the University of Chicago Podcast Network and the Stiegler Center in collaboration with the Chicago Booth Review. The show is produced by me, Matt Hodap, and Leah Cesarine, with production assistance from Utsav Gandhi, Matt Lucky, Sebastian Burka, Andy Shee, and Brooke Fox. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a review wherever you get your podcasts. And if you'd like to take our conversation further, also check out promarket.org, a publication of the Stiegler Center, and subscribe to our newsletter. Sign up at chicagobooth.edu/Stiegler to discover exciting new content, events, and insights. We hope you'll join our community, again at chicagobooth.edu/Stiegler.